Murfreesboro is one of the fastest growing and most progressive cities in the entire state of Tennessee. But you definitely take a trip back into time when you pay a visit to the Oaklands Mansion and Museum right here in Rutherford County.
Oaklands was a 274-acre land grant. It was given to a man by the name of Ezekiel White for a service in the Revolutionary War, and he never lived here. He sold it to his commanding officer, Colonel Hardy Murphy, and his daughter inherited this property, 274 acres, when her father passed away. And she and her husband, Dr. James Maney, M-A-N-E-Y, moved here from Murfreesboro, North Carolina, and built a house here on this property. But it was a simple two-room brick cabin. Years later, the plantation that they had established was passed on to their children, to their son, Lewis Maney, and his wife, Rachel Adeline Cannon. Her father was the first Whig governor of the state of Tennessee. So you had the Murphy descendants and the Cannon descendants living here. Cannonsburg was the first name of this town. It was named for the Cannon family, and Murfreesboro, obviously, for the Murphys. So there was quite a significant connection to this community and this house. And Oakland's Mansion is particularly interesting because it evolved. And when people come today and they see the front of the mansion and it's so elegant, and then they see the back, which is much more simple, they think, oh, those must be additions on the rear. But it's actually the opposite. They started out simple and they built forward as they gained in prosperity.
What year did they actually build this masterpiece?
We think about 1815. That's the year that Sally inherited this property, and we know they were living here by the 1820 census. So we're coming up on the 200th anniversary of the original two-room structure that they built.
Fantastic. And talk a little bit about the history of this mansion as far as the Civil War is concerned. What kind of role did it play during the Civil War?
Well, Oaklands became a 1,500-acre self-sustaining plantation. Now, to sustain themselves, they had to grow all the crops and produce necessary here for survival. And to do that, they had about 300 slaves that lived and worked here on the property. As a matter of fact, the graveyard across the street from us, Evergreen Cemetery, was originally part of the plantation. That was the slave burial ground. So because of all of these crops and these produce, and because of the spring that was here, which was an enormous resource for a plantation and also for troops. And so when the officers and their troops were camping, they came to Oaklands. They had all these resources available to them, and they had a retired doctor on site that his resources could also be used. Oaklands is listed on the National Register of Historic Places for two reasons. One, its architectural significance, and the other, Nathan Bedford Forrest's raid on the city of Murfreesboro. And it was July 13th, 1862, and Forrest and his men raided Colonel Duffield's men who were camped here on the plantation and overtook them. And that is the major significance of this house concerning the Civil War.
I also understand that there was one point in history when there was actually thought of maybe tearing the mansion down. Is that right?
Absolutely. After the Civil War, there was obviously no slavery to rebuild the plantation, so the Manneys had to look for other means of survival. And so they started selling off this property that they didn't need 1,500 acres anymore. So they sold it in tracts. Across the street, they sold 20 acres to the city of Murfreesboro to have a new cemetery for the city. They sold land in the back of the plantation to be a brickyard. Northfield Boulevard behind us was the north field of the plantation. And through the means of selling off property and creating the first subdivision in Rutherford County on the front driveway, they were able to keep the property, the majority of it, and the house in the family for several more years after the Civil War. But later they were forced to sell the house at auction. Adeline was a widow at that time. I think it was 1878. And she sold the house at auction and moved down the street to a house called Big Holly that we believe she already owned. And she and her sister renovated the house. And that was the end of the Manneys' time here. But several other wealthy families lived here after them. The Darrows, the first millionaire family in Rutherford County, lived here. They had the first car in the county. But eventually, this house became too big for modern lives. And by 1954, the house didn't really have a purpose. And so it was left vacant, and it was very heavily vandalized. The front lawn had been converted into a park for the city. There were ball fields and swimming pools. And so the city decided to demolish the mansion so that they could make room for more park expansion and more public housing. But they were open to other ideas, and a group of 10 ladies in the community formed what they called Oaklands Association, and they asked the city to donate the house and a little bit of land to them, and they were willing to do that with a stipulation that it be open as a tourist attraction. And fortunately, we've celebrated over 50 years of being open to the public now.
Good for them. Well, you had mentioned earlier in the interview about we are currently standing in the gentleman's parlor. Talk about this room just a little bit and some of the neater things about this particular room.
There's so many fascinating features about Oakland, so where do we begin? This is the first room that the ladies had re-wallpapered when they converted the mansion to be a museum, when they restored the mansion. This wallpaper is flocked. It was very popular in the 1860s and then again in the 1960s, and that's probably one of the reasons that they chose it first for this room. Gentleman's parlor was to have a dark and more somber effect, not as bright and cheery as the ladies' parlor across the hall. We're very proud of having a third of the collection that's in the mansion original to the home while the Mannies lived here. Since it was vacant and it was owned by several other families, we think that's a good sign that the ladies who established the museum worked diligently and have for years to expand the collection and bring in as many original pieces as possible. And behind me is one of our favorites. It's a bookcase that's original to the home. It was made of walnut, which was a common wood for furniture making in the 1860s, but the Mannies wanted to look like rosewood. And so they hired a faux grain artist who did a phenomenal job. And the bookcase is absolutely beautiful. It's a Rococo Revival style. It's got Gothic influences and fully pierced quatrefoil included in the carvings on the piece. And we're told that they had two, one on either side of the fireplace, but the location of the other one's not known. And there are beautiful things throughout the mansion, but when you go upstairs and you look out the windows and you imagine what they would have seen when they looked out the windows and saw fields and crops and people working the plantation, and when you go to the children's wing and look out the windows there, even the nursery has some of the prettiest views in the mansion. They look out not only over the fields, but over the spring as well. The gift shop and the offices are open 7 days a week. But Monday is reserved for cleaning the mansion, and we do take reservations for larger groups. But we're open Tuesday through Saturday for regular walk-in tourists, 10 to 4, and Sunday 1 to 4. And you need to arrive about an hour before we close because you have a 15-minute orientation video that you watch, and the guided tour of the mansion is about 45 minutes.
How glad are you that the ladies back in the 1950s decided they wanted to make sure that this building was not torn down?
I'm very glad because I'm not sure where I would be standing right now if it wasn't here. We love Oakland's. People fall in love with this house. And many of the tourists that come here and visit other houses, historic homes throughout the country, tell us that they feel more at home here. They enjoy that they get to walk through all the rooms and get to really experience them. They feel like people can really understand how lives were lived in this house.
If you would like to take a day trip to Rutherford County and visit the OaklandsMansion, admission is $10 for adults and $5 for children. The address is 900 North Manny Avenue in Murfreesboro. Reporting in Murfreesboro, Barry Hyatt, NCTV.